My grandmother died on a Wednesday in early October, which is not a remarkable thing except that she died alone in the farmhouse kitchen, seated at the table, with a cup of tea that had gone cold beside her and her reading glasses folded on top of the crossword puzzle she had not finished. The paramedics told my Aunt Renee that there was no struggle. She had simply stopped, the way a clock stops when the battery gives out, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone there to notice. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. I was 300 miles away in Cincinnati when my phone rang. I was sitting in the parking garage of the hospital where I work, still in scrubs, eating a granola bar because I had not had time for lunch and it was now 7 in the evening. I did not recognize the number at first. It was a 740 area code, Hester County, southeastern Ohio, the part of the state that most people in Cincinnati do not think about unless they are passing through it on the way to somewhere else. My name is Clara Marsh. I am 31 years old. I am a licensed practical nurse in the cardiovascular unit at St. Vincent Medical Center, and I have worked there for 6 years, covering nights and weekends and every holiday shift available, because I am not the kind of person anyone worries about leaving behind when the roster is being filled. I grew up in Hester County in a town called Borden's Mill, and I left when I was 18 to go to nursing school on a grant I had applied for without telling anyone in my family because I had learned by then that telling people what I wanted before I had secured it was a reliable way to watch it disappear. I have not moved back. I have thought about it the way you think about a place you came from that still holds the shape of your childhood, but something always kept me where I was. Cheaper to stay. Easier to stay. Safer, in the way that distance is always safer when your family has a talent for rearranging things in your absence. My grandmother's name was Lottie Marsh. She was 79 years old and had lived her entire life within 40 miles of where she was born. She grew up on her family's farm in Borden's Mill, married my grandfather Dale when she was 22, raised 3 children in the farmhouse he built with his brother on the land her family had passed to her, and stayed there alone for 11 years after Dale died of a stroke in 2012, tending the vegetable garden and the 2 remaining apple trees and the house itself with the kind of careful maintenance that is less about love for the structure and more about refusing to give anything the satisfaction of falling apart. My grandfather's death left the farm to Lottie outright, which everyone in the family understood and no one disputed, at least not openly. There was a will. There was a county filing. Dale had been a careful man in the way that men who build things tend to be careful, and he had made sure that the farm, all 42 acres including the house, the barn, the equipment shed, and the 2 leased crop parcels on the eastern ridge, was Lottie's to do with as she chose. My father, whose name is Gordon, and his 2 sisters Renee and Patrice, had each received a modest sum from the estate and the clear understanding that the land was their mother's. That clarity lasted about 2 years. By the time I had been in Cincinnati long enough to miss Borden's Mill without wanting to go back, the conversations at the edges of family gatherings had shifted. My father talked about the farm in a different register than he used to, not with nostalgia but with the particular tone of someone inventorying an asset. He and Renee had started going out there more often, sometimes together, sometimes with their spouses, and the visits had a purpose to them that was harder to name than just checking in on an aging mother. Patrice, who had always been the quietest of the 3, and the one who most resembled my grandmother in her stubbornness and her precision, had noticed it too. She mentioned it to me once on the phone in a way that was careful, measuring whether I was tracking the same thing she was. I just did not know what to do with what I was tracking. Here is what I knew by the time Lottie died. The farm was worth considerably more than it had been when Dale died. The leased parcels on the eastern ridge had been producing well for a tenant farmer named Kessler who had rented them for 12 years and paid reliably, and the rising price of agricultural land in that part of Ohio had pushed the assessed value to something my father mentioned once, almost casually, as being in the range of $400,000, possibly more depending on the timber on the western edge. My father ran a heating and cooling business in Chillicothe that had been struggling for 3 years. Renee's husband had recently lost a significant amount of money in a failed franchise investment that everyone in the family was pretending had not happened. Patrice worked as a librarian in a small town near Zanesville and was, by every visible measure, fine, but fine in the way that meant she was managing rather than comfortable. And I was in Cincinnati working nights and eating granola bars in parking garages. The call that night was from Renee. She was not unkind about it. She told me what had happened in a straightforward way, gave me the details the paramedics had given her, and said the funeral arrangements would be handled by the family, meaning herself and my father and Patrice, meaning I should come home for the service and bring nothing because everything was being taken care of. That phrase, everything is being taken care of. I wrote it down on the back of the granola bar wrapper because I was a nurse and I had learned that when a family member uses that phrase at the beginning of a conversation about a patient's care, something is already in motion that the patient does not know about yet. The funeral was 4 days later. I drove down on a Thursday morning and arrived at Lottie's farmhouse in the early afternoon, which was the earliest I could leave after finishing my shift. The house looked the way it always looked, white clapboard with the green shutters that Lottie repainted every 5 years whether they needed it or not. The porch with its 2 rocking chairs and the hook by the door where she kept the basket she used for carrying things from the garden. The hook was empty. Someone had moved the basket or taken it. I stood on the porch for a moment before I went inside and looked at the empty hook, and felt the specific sourceless unease of a place that has just lost the person who gave it its logic. My father and Renee were already there, along with their spouses. Patrice arrived 2 hours after me, driving up from Zanesville with a casserole dish balanced on the passenger seat, and the expression she always wore when she was bracing for something. We ate dinner together at the long kitchen table, the same table where Lottie had been sitting when she died, and the conversation was careful and warm and full of stories about Lottie that were true and funny and occasionally tender, and no one said anything about the farm or its value or what would happen next, which meant everyone was thinking about it. After dinner, when the dishes were being washed and the conversation had settled into the comfortable low hum of people who have known each other long enough that they can be in the same room without filling every silence, I excused myself and went upstairs. Lottie's bedroom was the larger of the 2 upstairs rooms, the one with the window that looked out over the backfield toward the old equipment shed that had not held equipment in years, and was used now mostly for storage. Her things were where they always were, the bureau with the oval mirror, the quilt folded at the foot of the bed, the nightstand with its lamp and its stack of library books, 2 of which were still checked out and would need to be returned. On the hook behind the door hung her work aprons, the heavy canvas one she wore for gardening and the lighter cotton one she wore in the kitchen, 3 of them in a row, faded to the same pale blue-gray that all frequently washed fabric eventually becomes. I do not know what made me take them down. It was not a plan. I was not looking for anything. I was standing in my grandmother's bedroom in the early evening of the day before her funeral, and I was doing the thing I do in any situation where I feel something I cannot immediately name, which is to occupy my hands. I took the aprons off the hook and folded them on the bed, one on top of the other, with the care I would give to anything of hers. The third one, the bottom one, was heavier than the others. There was something in the pocket. It was an envelope. Standard size business envelope sealed with nothing written on the outside. The paper had taken on the slightly soft quality of something that has been carried for a long time in a cotton pocket, warmed and cooled and warmed again through seasons of use. I turned it over in my hands and felt the contents shift. More than one piece of paper, several stiff enough to be documents rather than letters. I set it on the nightstand and looked at it. I am a practical person by training and by disposition. 6 years in a cardiovascular unit will cure you of most superstition and all sentimentality about objects. But I sat on the edge of my grandmother's bed in the smell of her room, which was cedar and the particular sweetness of the hand cream she used, and I looked at that envelope for a long time before I opened it. Inside were 3 things. The first was a folded document, official, 2 pages, with a county recorder's stamp and a filing date. The second was a handwritten note on a piece of notepaper printed with small blue flowers, 4 lines in my grandmother's handwriting. The third was a key, brass, old, cut in a style I did not recognize, attached to a small tag on which someone had written in ink so faded it was almost gone, a single word, shed. I read the document first. It was a deed. Not the deed to the farmhouse and the 42 acres. A separate deed filed with the Hester County Recorder's Office 11 years ago, 14 months after my grandfather died, conveying a parcel of land to a single named individual. The parcel was described in the legal language that county deeds use, the metes and bounds description that traces the edges of a piece of land with compass bearings and distances that only make full sense on a survey map. But the acreage was given plainly enough, 61 acres. The location was given as Colton Township, Hester County, roughly 8 miles east of Borden's Mill on the far side of Greer Ridge. The name on the deed was mine. Clara and Marsh, sole owner. I read it twice. 3 times. I looked at the filing date. I looked at the notary seal. I looked at the name of the attorney listed as preparer, a firm in the county seat called Whitlow and Fenn that I had never heard of. Then I unfolded the notepaper and read my grandmother's 4 lines. The writing was her late writing, the script she used in the last few years when her hands had started to ache in the mornings, slightly larger than her earlier writing, each letter more deliberate. She had written, "Clara, this is the Colton land your grandfather's mother left. Dale wanted it kept for one of you. I chose you because you are the one who won't let anyone talk you out of it. The key is for the shed. Go see it before you tell anyone." I sat with that note for a long time. Before you tell anyone. I put everything back in the envelope and the envelope in my jacket pocket, and I went downstairs and helped clear the remaining dishes and said goodnight and drove to the motel on Route 33 where I had booked a room for the 2 nights of my visit, and I lay on the motel bed in the dark with the envelope on the nightstand beside me, and thought about 61 acres on the far side of Greer Ridge that I had not known existed until 40 minutes ago and that had apparently been mine for 11 years. The funeral was Friday morning at the Methodist Church in Borden's Mill, where Lottie had been a member for 50 years. The church was full. My grandmother had been the kind of person who showed up for things, who brought food to people who were sick and remembered the names of people's children and grandchildren and asked about them specifically enough to make clear she had been paying attention. The people in that church were not there out of obligation. They were there because they had liked her, which is rarer than it should be at funerals. My father spoke. Renee read a scripture. Patrice sat beside me in the second pew and held my hand during the hymns, which was something she had done at every difficult occasion since we were children, not from sentiment but from the practical understanding that certain moments are better with your hand in someone else's. I was grateful for it. I was also thinking, underneath the grief and the music and the smell of flowers, about a county recorder's stamp and the word shed written in fading ink on a brass key tag. The gathering afterward was at the farmhouse. People came and went through the kitchen door for 3 hours, bringing covered dishes and staying to talk and drift out again, and the house filled and emptied with the particular rhythm of rural grief, which moves through food and conversation and incremental departure rather than any single moment of release. My father was the center of it, the way the oldest child often is at a parent's funeral, receiving condolences and managing the logistics of who needed what and where things should go, and in that managing I could see the shape of what he thought came next. He was already in the house differently. He moved through the rooms with the practiced ease of someone mapping a space he expects to inherit. Renee moved the same way. Patrice watched them both and said nothing. I stayed until nearly 7, helped clean up and said my goodnights. My father asked if I was staying through the weekend. I told him I had a shift Saturday night, which was true, though I had asked a colleague to cover it, and I had not yet decided whether I would use the extra day or not. He nodded and squeezed my arm and said safe drive, and I went out to my car and sat in it for 10 minutes in the dark driveway before I turned the key. Saturday morning I drove to the Hester County Recorder's office. It opened at 8:30. I was there at 8:25. The building was the kind of county government building that looks exactly like what it is, brick, functional, underfunded, with a parking lot that needed repaving and a lobby that smelled like fluorescent lights and old carpet. The clerk who helped me was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a cord and the particular competence of someone who has been doing one thing well for a long time. I gave her the filing number from the deed, and she pulled it up on her screen in under a minute. Everything was in order. The deed was valid, recorded, indexed. The grantor was Lottie Mae Marsh. The grantee was Clara and Marsh. The property description matched what I had read in the envelope. The recording date was 11 years ago, late October, 6 weeks after Lottie had notarized the document at Whitlow and Fenn. I asked for a certified copy. The clerk printed and stamped one and handed it across the counter with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a person who has spent a career handing people documents that change things, and I paid the $4 fee and walked back out to my car. I sat in the recorder's office parking lot and called the number listed for Whitlow and Fenn in the county seat. The office was closed Saturday, but there was a message with an after-hours contact for urgent estate matters. I left a message. I said my name, my grandmother's name, the deed filing number, and that I needed to speak with whoever had handled the transaction 11 years ago regarding a property transfer I had recently become aware of. I said I would be available that afternoon and the following morning. Then I drove east on Route 33 toward Greer Ridge. I had not been to the eastern part of the county since I was a teenager, and had gone with my grandfather one fall to look at a timber tract he was considering selling. The road climbed toward the ridge through second-growth forest interrupted by farm fields and the occasional trailer with a satellite dish and a yard full of the practical accumulated equipment of rural life, mowers and dog kennels and woodpiles stacked neat against the coming cold. The October light was good, low in gold and without sentiment. I drove with the certified copy of the deed on the passenger seat, and my grandmother's note folded inside it, and the brass key in my jacket pocket. The parcel was harder to find than I expected. The address on the deed was a rural route number that my phone's navigation had trouble resolving into a usable location, and I spent 20 minutes driving back and forth along the eastern base of Greer Ridge before I found the access road. A gravel track running back from the county road into the tree line, marked with a rusted mailbox that had no name on it, and a wooden post with a faded orange survey stake that had been there long enough to develop a lean. I turned in. The track ran through mixed hardwood forest for about a quarter-mile before opening into a clearing. The clearing was larger than I expected. To the left was the remnant of an old orchard, maybe 30 trees in 2 rows, most of them still standing though some had gone sideways with age and one had split and fallen into its neighbor in a way that looked like it had happened several years ago, and been left as it fell. To the right, the clearing opened onto a field that had been allowed to go to grass and scrub brush, with the evidence of former cultivation still legible in the low ridges of old furrows. And at the far edge of the clearing, where the tree line began again on the western side, was a building. It was larger than the word shed suggested, larger than the shed on Lottie's farm had led me to expect. A timber-framed structure with a corrugated metal roof, maybe 40 feet wide and 60 feet deep, with 2 sets of double doors on the front face and a smaller entry door to one side. The exterior boards had weathered to gray and needed paint, but the structure itself was sound, the roof line clean and unbroken, the foundation properly built. Someone had taken care of this building, or had taken care of it until recently. The weeds around the base were high enough to indicate a few years of neglect, but the building itself stood solid. I walked to the small entry door and tried the brass key. It turned on the second attempt, the lock stiff but functional, and the door swung inward on hinges that protested briefly and then held. The interior was dim, the light coming from 4 small windows set high along the south wall. I stood for a moment while my eyes adjusted. The air smelled of dry wood and old oil and something metallic, a smell I recognized without immediately placing, the particular smell of metal that has been kept dry and has not rusted. When I could see clearly, I walked into the center of the building and stood and looked. There were 7 of them. 7 pieces of agricultural machinery, arranged in 2 rows along the length of the building, each one covered with a canvas tarp secured with bungee cords. The tarps were the same shade of green, clearly from the same source, installed at the same time by the same person who had thought about the arrangement and the protection before covering anything. I walked to the nearest and lifted the edge of the nearest tarp. Underneath was a tractor. Old. Very old. Red, or what had once been red before decades had faded and chipped it toward a deeper, more complex color. I was not someone who knew agricultural machinery well, but I could see that this was not a relic in the negative sense. It was original and complete, with equipment I didn't understand and markings I couldn't read in the dim light, and it had been stored here with intention, each tire blocked, the engine cowling intact, the seat worn but present. I replaced the tarp edge and walked to the next one. Another tractor, different, smaller and older looking than the first, with a different configuration that I could not have named but could recognize as belonging to a different era, a different generation of the same basic idea. Also red. Also stored carefully. The third was not a tractor. It was something larger, more complex, a machine with multiple moving parts and what appeared to be a series of conveyors or belts, though they were folded and stored in a way that made the whole thing compact. I stood and looked at it for a long time. I did not know what it was, but I knew enough about the way people preserve things to understand that someone had thought this worth preserving. I walked the full length of the building. 7 machines. All covered. All stored with the same care. All in the dry. At the back of the building, on a wooden workbench along the rear wall, was a metal box, the kind with a hasp latch and a small lock. It was not locked. The latch was simply closed. I opened it. Inside was a spiral-bound notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover, and underneath the notebook, a manila folder with a rubber band around it. I carried both to the light near the entry door and opened the notebook. The handwriting on the first page was my grandfather Dale's. I knew his writing from birthday cards and the labels on the preserves jars in Lottie's pantry. Neat, upright, economical, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write for the practical purpose of keeping records. The first line read, Dale Marsh, machine log, started November 2001. I turned the pages slowly. The notebook was a record. An acquisition record, a maintenance log, a catalog of provenance, each entry numbered and dated and written in my grandfather's hand up through 2009, and then in a different hand from 2009 onward, a hand I eventually recognized as Lottie's early writing, before the morning ache had changed her script. The log covered each of the 7 machines, their year of manufacture, where they had come from, what had been paid for them or traded for them, what work had been done on them and when what parts had been sourced and from where. There were entries about consultations with someone referred to only as BH. A local figure apparently, someone whose initials and expertise appeared throughout the later entries in a way that made clear they were the one who knew what these machines were worth. There was a note in Lottie's hand at the top of the last page of entries, dated 3 years ago. It said only, Clara will know what to do. B.H. has the buyer list. Call Whitlow and Finn first. I closed the notebook. I stood in the dim building with the smell of dry old metal around me, and the October light coming through the high windows, and I looked at the 7 covered shapes in their rows and I understood several things at once, the way you understand things when the information you've been given finally assembles itself into a shape you can recognize. My grandmother had known for years that this would fall to me. She had not told me because telling me before the time came would have meant that the information was loose in the family, available to be acted on, possible to be rearranged by the people who rearrange things. She had kept it in an apron pocket, the most private possible location, the place no one else would think to look, and she had left me a key and a 4-line note and enough to get started. I opened the manila folder. The folder held 2 documents. The first was a property survey dated 9 years ago, showing the 61 acres with the cleared parcels, the orchard, the access road, and the building labeled plainly as equipment storage. The second was a valuation report, 4 pages, prepared by an appraiser named Robert Harlan out of the county seat, dated 18 months ago. The report covered each of the 7 machines individually with photographs, condition assessments, and comparable sale data from recent auctions in the specialty agricultural equipment market. I read the summary page first. Then I went back and read each machine's individual assessment. Then I read the summary page again. The numbers were not like anything I had expected. I had not come here with expectations exactly, but I had come with a general understanding that old farm machinery was old farm machinery, a curiosity at best, a storage problem at worst. The numbers in Robert Harlan's report were not curiosity numbers. They were not storage problem numbers. They were the numbers of a market I had not known existed, a collector market, a specialist market, where particular machines in particular conditions with documented provenance were sought after by people with the resources to seek them deliberately. The most valuable item in the building, according to Harlan, was the large machine in the 3rd row, the complex one I had not recognized. It was a threshing machine, a specific model from a specific year of manufacture, and it was, in Harlan's words, one of perhaps 3 known surviving examples in operational condition. His appraised value was a range. The low end of the range was a number that would have taken me 8 years to save. The high end was considerably higher. I set the folder down on the workbench. I am not the kind of person who makes fast decisions. 6 years of cardiovascular nursing will teach you that the first impulse, however correct it feels, benefits from being held for 30 seconds while you verify the data. I stood in the quiet building and I verified the data. The deed was real. The recording was confirmed. The appraiser had been here 18 months ago, had seen these machines, had written a professional document with his name and his license number on it. The notebook went back to 2001. My grandfather had spent years building whatever this was, and then Lottie had kept it, and now it was mine. Before I told anyone, I photographed every page in the folder and every page in the notebook with my phone. I photographed the outside of the building and each of the 7 tarped machines from the front and the side. I relocked the door. I put the notebook and the folder back in the metal box and the metal box back where I had found it on the workbench. Then I walked back out to my car and sat in it at the end of the gravel track and called the number for Whitlow and Fenn again. This time someone answered. The voice was a man in his 60s, brisk without being unfriendly, with the particular tone of a country attorney who has handled enough estates to have seen most of what people can do to one another over property. His name was Thomas Fenn, and when I said Lottie Marsh's name, there was a pause in which I could hear him pulling something into focus. "I expected this call," he said. "I'm sorry for your loss. Your grandmother was a very precise person." "She was," I said. "You've been to the Colton parcel this morning. And you've seen the machines." "Yes." Another pause. "Then you know what you're dealing with. Or you're starting to." "I have the appraisal," I said. "That's the one Harlan did 18 months ago," he said. "The market's moved since then. There were 2 auctions last spring, one in Kentucky and one in Indiana, that pushed certain category values considerably. I'd recommend getting a current assessment before you have any conversations about sales." "Who is B.H.?" I said. "The name in the notebook." "Bud Harlan," Fenn said. "Robert Harlan's father. Retired now, but he was the one who helped your grandfather identify and acquire most of those machines over about 15 years. Knows the market as well as anyone in the region. He's been expecting your call too." I looked at the gravel track and the tree line and the October sky above it and the clear, particular light of a morning that had started in a motel room and was now something else entirely. "I need to understand the legal situation before I do anything else," I said. "The deed is in my name. I've pulled the certified copy from the county recorder. But the farm my father and his sisters expect to inherit, is any of this connected to that estate?" "No," Fenn said, and his voice was the voice of a man answering a question he had been asked to answer clearly. "The Colton parcel was deeded to you 11 years ago as a standalone transfer, separate from the farm estate entirely. It predates your grandmother's death by 11 years. It is not part of her probate estate. Your father and his sisters have no legal claim to it." He said it with the flatness of fact rather than opinion, which I respected. "My grandmother didn't want me to tell anyone yet," I said. "She told me you'd say that," he said. "She said you'd understand why. She also said when you're ready call Bud Harlan first, then Robert Harlan for the updated appraisal, and then call me for the representation letter. In that order." I wrote down Bud Harlan's number as Fenn read it to me. After I hung up, I drove back toward Borden's Mill on the county road with the 61 acres behind me, and the November light ahead of me, and the full weight of what my grandmother had done settling into my chest the way the cold settles into a field in the first hour before frost. She had spent 11 years carrying this. Tending the building, keeping the log updated, making the calls to Fenn and the Harlans, watching the market, waiting. She had done it alone without telling her children, without telling me, because telling any of us was the same as telling all of us, and telling all of us was the same as losing control of it. She had made her plan in the year after my grandfather died, when the grief was fresh enough that no one would have thought to question where she was driving on a Tuesday in October, and she had executed it quietly and correctly and completely, and she had carried the result in her apron pocket until the morning she sat down at her kitchen table and didn't get up again. I thought about the 4 lines she had written. "I chose you because you are the one who won't let anyone talk you out of it." I had never known she thought about me that way. I had known she loved me, in the practical specific way she expressed love, the birthday cards that came on the right day and the way she made the particular foods I liked when I visited and the yearly phone calls where she asked questions about my work that made clear she had been paying attention. But I had not known that she had been watching me in the way that she apparently had, watching me leave and build a life and hold that life steady through the things that came at it, and that she had decided on the basis of that watching that I was the right person for this particular trust. I drove through Borden's Mill without stopping and kept going north until I was on the highway, and then I pulled into a rest stop and sat in my car, and let myself feel what I had been holding at a distance since I opened the envelope in her bedroom. My grandmother was dead. She had been the clearest and most honest presence in my family for 31 years, and she had been going to be gone for the rest of my life, and there was nothing to be done about that. But she had spent her last 11 years making sure that when she was gone, I would have something that was completely and legally and irreversibly mine, something she had chosen me for by name, something no one else in the family could reach, And she had done it with the same care and patience she brought to everything: the vegetable garden, the apple trees, the shutters she repainted every 5 years, the crossword puzzle she had not quite finished. I wiped my face and pulled back onto the highway. Patrice called at 4 that afternoon. She was still at the farmhouse, the last of the siblings to leave, which was characteristic of her. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases, because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now let's get back to the story. She asked if I had made it back towards Cincinnati safely, and I told her I was on the road. There was a pause that contained something it wanted to ask and was deciding whether to ask it. "Did you find something?" she said. I considered the question. Patrice was not my father, and she was not Renee. She was the person who had noticed what was happening at the farm years before I named it, the person who had held my hand through the hymns without being asked, the person who was fine in the way of someone managing rather than thriving. She was also the person who, of everyone in my family, had the longest and most genuine relationship with Lottie, the one who called her on the right days without needing reminders, the one who still wrote actual letters. "Not yet," I said. "I'm still processing things." Another pause. "Okay," she said. And then, in the careful way of someone who has learned to wait for things, "Call me when you're ready." "I will," I said. I meant it. But first I needed the appraisal and the representation letter and a conversation with Bud Harlan, who knew the market and knew the machines and had apparently been waiting for my call for 11 years. I drove north through the fading October afternoon with the certified deed in my bag, and my grandmother's note folded inside it, and the brass key in my jacket pocket. The same key she had put there, in the pocket of the apron she wore every day, where it had been warm from her body and waiting for the hand that was supposed to find it. Not anyone's hand. Mine. Bud Harlan answered on the second ring. His voice was the voice of a man in his late 70s who had spent most of those years outdoors. Rough at the edges but clear in the middle, the kind of voice that does not waste syllables. I had pulled off the highway at a truck stop outside Lancaster, and was sitting in my car with the engine running for warmth and the notebook photographs open on my phone. I told him who I was, and there was a silence on his end. Not the silence of someone who needs time to recall the name, but the silence of someone who has been expecting something for a long time, and is taking a moment to register that it has arrived. "Lottie's Clara," he said. Not a question. "Yes. She told me you'd call after she was gone." Another pause. "I'm sorry about Lottie. She was a straight shooter. You don't meet many of those." "No," I said. "You don't." He asked me what I had seen at the Colton building, and I told him, working through each of the 7 machines in the order they sat in the rows, describing what I could see from my photographs and what I had read in the machine log. He listened without interrupting, which is a rarer skill than people acknowledge, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather found the first one in 1998, he said. "A farm auction over in Guernsey County. He didn't know what he had yet. He just knew it was old and good and cheap because the people running the auction didn't know either." He paused. I was there too. We were both bidding on the same piece and he outbid me by $40, which I held against him for about 3 days before I went to introduce myself. That was the beginning of it. The beginning of 23 years of deliberate, patient acquisition that I had not known was happening, conducted by a man I had thought of primarily as my grandfather, who grew tomatoes and fixed engines and drove a truck with a bench seat and watched my field hockey games. "The threshing machine," I said. Harlan's report calls it one of 3 known operational examples. It was 2 known when your grandfather found it, Bud said. He located it in a barn in Muskingum County in 2004. Owner didn't know what he had. The restoration took 4 years. I sourced most of the replacement parts myself from contacts in 3 states. A beat. When Robert appraised it 18 months ago, we had learned about a 3rd example in western Pennsylvania that had surfaced. Changes the rarity calculus somewhat, but not dramatically. The condition on yours is better than the Pennsylvania piece. What does the market look like now? I said. Better than 18 months ago for most categories. There were 2 significant auctions in the spring. The Kentucky sale had a comparable piece, not a threshing machine, but from the same era and category, that went for more than Robert's upper estimate on yours. He said the number and I wrote it on the back of a receipt from my center console. The collector base for this equipment is specific and serious. These are not impulse buyers. They know what they want and they follow the market, and when the right piece appears they move. Robert's report mentions a buyer list, I said. My buyer list, Bud said. 14 names. I've been maintaining it since 2008. 3 of them have contacted me in the past 2 years specifically asking about threshing machines. One of them is a collector in Virginia who has been looking for 10 years and has the resources to make a decision quickly when the right thing comes along. He paused. Your grandmother asked me not to reach out to any of them until you called. I haven't. I looked at the receipt with the number written on it. The truck stop was bright through my windshield. Diesel exhaust and fluorescent light, and the sound of a truck pulling out of the lot with its air brakes releasing. What do I need to do? I said. He told me in the same order Fenn had described, get the updated appraisal from Robert, get the representation letter from Fenn, then have a conversation about the buyer list and the sequencing of sales. He said not to rush the threshing machine. He said the right buyer would pay more for the confidence of a properly documented sale than they would save by moving fast. He said your grandmother understood that, and she told me you would too. Did she tell you much about me? I asked. A short pause that held something fond. She told me you were a nurse in the city. She said you left and made something without anyone's help, and that you had the kind of patience that comes from doing hard work that matters. He stopped. She said you were the one Dale would have chosen too, if he'd lived long enough to set it up properly. I did not say anything for a moment. Call Robert Monday morning, Bud said. He's been expecting it. I thanked him and hung up and sat in the truck stop lot for a while longer than I needed to. A family came out of the building with paper cups and a tired child who was being carried over one parent's shoulder with the boneless surrender of a child past their limit. Ordinary Saturday evening. I watched them get into their van and drive away, and then I pulled back onto the highway and drove the rest of the way to Cincinnati. My apartment was the way I had left it Thursday morning, which was 2 days ago, though it felt longer. A coffee mug in the sink, a scrub top draped over the back of the bathroom door. The particular stillness of a place that has been empty for a short time and has not yet decided whether to be welcoming about it. I put my bag down and sat on the couch without turning on any lights and looked at the city out the window for a while. The grid of it, the light, the distance from Borden's Mill and Greer Ridge, and a gravel track running into the trees toward a building full of things I had not known existed until yesterday. My phone had 11 missed calls. My father 4 times. Renee twice. A number I didn't recognize twice, which turned out when I listened to the voicemails to be my father calling from Renee's phone because I had not picked up his. The remaining 3 were from colleagues about the shift coverage I had arranged. I listened to all of my father's messages. The first was from Friday evening, after I had left the funeral gathering. His voice was warm and tired in the way of someone who has spent the day receiving condolences, and he said he wanted to talk about the farm when I had a chance, nothing urgent, just some things he and Renee had been thinking about. The second was from Saturday morning, slightly more purposeful, asking me to call him back. The third was from Saturday afternoon, when his voice had shifted into a register I recognized from childhood, the voice he used when he had decided something and was in the process of implementing it. He said he and Renee had spoken with an estate attorney in Chillicothe, and there were some things about Mom's estate they needed to discuss with all 3 siblings. The fourth message was from Saturday evening, 2 hours ago. His voice was matter of fact. He said that he and Renee had been in touch with a real estate agent about the farm, just preliminary conversations, nothing decided, but that it would be helpful to have everyone on the same page and could I call him back this weekend. A real estate agent. Preliminary conversations. I set the phone face down on the cushion beside me and sat with that for a while. My father had buried his mother on Friday morning, and by Saturday afternoon, he was in preliminary conversations with a real estate agent. I did not know exactly what had been said or what had been agreed to or whether Patrice knew, but I could see the shape of it well enough. My father's business was struggling. Renee's household finances were under pressure from the franchise loss. The farm was worth something substantial, and my grandmother had been dead for less than 72 hours. I thought about Lottie at that kitchen table. I thought about her carrying the key in her apron pocket for 11 years. I thought about 4 lines written in her late handwriting on notepaper with small blue flowers. Clara will know what to do. Go see it before you tell anyone. She had not been naive about her children. She had seen them clearly, the way you see people most clearly when you love them and have lived alongside them for decades and have watched the ways they behave when they think you are not watching. She had made her choices accordingly. She had moved the thing that mattered to her most completely out of reach of the people who would reach for it without asking. I did not call my father back that night. Sunday I went into the hospital for 4 hours to cover a short-staffed morning segment for a colleague who had returned the favor on my Saturday shift. Working helped. It always does. The unit was its own world, the monitors and the charts and the particular demands of patients whose hearts were doing things hearts were not supposed to do. And for 4 hours I was entirely inside that world and outside everything else. When I came back out to the parking lot at 1 in the afternoon, the sky was low and gray, and the first cold of real autumn was in the air. I called Robert Harlan from the parking lot. He was courteous and professional, with the measured confidence of a man who has been appraising things long enough to know the difference between what a piece is worth and what a seller hopes it is worth. He knew the building and the machines well from the assessment 18 months ago, and he said he could come back the following Thursday or Friday for an updated examination. He said the market movement since his previous report was meaningful but not uniform. Some categories had held, some had moved up, and the threshing machine specifically had benefited from a refinement in the collector community's understanding of what surviving operational examples commanded. He said his updated report would reflect current comparable sales data from the past 6 months and would be suitable for any purpose I needed it for. I told him Thursday. Then I sat in the parking lot a little longer and called Thomas Finn. He picked up on the third ring with the same brisk warmth as before, asked how I was holding up, and listened when I told him what I had been thinking about over the past 2 days. I told him about my father's messages and the real estate agent and the timeline. He was quiet while I talked, the focused quiet of someone making notes. When I finished, he said, "The farm estate will go through probate in Hester County. That process takes time and is completely separate from the Colton parcel. Your ownership of the Colton land is not affected by anything that happens in your grandmother's estate." "I know," I said, "but I want to understand the full picture before anyone else starts asking questions." "That's wise," he said. "I'll prepare the representation letter confirming your ownership and my firm's role. That letter will be useful if anyone inquires about the Colton property, formally or otherwise. It establishes the chain of title clearly and directs any communication to this office." "My father doesn't know the Colton parcel exists," I said. "Your grandmother's estate filing will not reference it," Finn said. "The Colton deed is a completed transfer. It predates her death by 11 years. It will not appear in the probate inventory because it was no longer her property." I thought about that. 11 years ago, a Tuesday in October, Lottie had driven herself to Finn's office in the county seat and signed a deed and filed it with the county recorder. And from that moment the 61 acres had been mine without my knowing it. Mine through every shift I worked and every year I stayed in Cincinnati. Mine while my father was having preliminary conversations about the farm and Renee was dealing with the franchise loss, and everyone was calculating the value of things they expected to inherit. It had been mine the whole time. "I'll have the letter to you by Wednesday," Finn said. I thanked him and hung up. The parking lot was emptying out around me, the Sunday afternoon shift change underway, nurses and technicians moving between the building and their cars with the particular economy of people who have been inside for 12 hours and want to be outside for 12 more. I called Patrice. She answered on the second ring. I could hear her kitchen in the background. The small sounds of someone doing something domestic without much thought, dishes or sorting or tidying. She said my name in the specific tone she used when she was glad I had called, and was trying not to make too much of it. I need to tell you something, I said. But I need a few more days before I can tell you all of it. A pause. Okay. Did you know Dad called a real estate agent about the farm? The pause was different this time. Longer and with something in it that was not surprise exactly but was close to it. The sound of a fact landing in a space where it had been half expected but not confirmed. He mentioned it to me Saturday night, she said. He called it preliminary. He said he and Renee had just been asking about options. Mom has been dead for 3 days, I said. I know. Her voice was careful. I told him that. What did he say? He said Mom would have wanted the family to be secure. She said it the way you repeat something you were told to repeat so that someone else can hear what it actually sounds like. He said she always worried about us. I thought about Lottie in the kitchen with her crossword puzzle, and her cold tea and her apron on the hook with a deed in the pocket. She did worry about some of us more than others, I said. Patrice was quiet for a moment. Clara, what did you find? In a few days, I said. I promise. Before Dad does anything formal. She accepted that the way she accepted most things, not without cost but without protest, and we talked for a few more minutes about the funeral and Lottie and the particular specific way our grandmother had been herself until the end, and then I said goodnight and went back to my apartment and made dinner and did not call my father back. He called again Monday morning at 8:15. I was getting ready for a Tuesday night shift, which meant I was sleeping on a shifted schedule, and 8:15 was not a reasonable hour for me on a day I was working nights. I let it ring. He called back at 9. I answered because I was awake by then, and because not answering a fourth time was going to require an explanation I was not ready to give. Clara. His voice was the voice from the third message, purposeful, already in the middle of the thing he had decided. Hi, Dad. I've been trying to reach you. I know. I had shifts. A brief pause that accepted this and moved on. I wanted to talk to you about the farm before things get too far along. Renee and I have been talking to an agent, Diane Birch. She's based in the county seat. She's handled a few of the bigger land sales in Hester County in the last couple years. She thinks the farm could come to market at somewhere around $380, maybe $400 if we time it right. Has the estate even been filed yet? I said. That's in process. Fells in Chillicothe is handling it. It's straightforward. Mom didn't have much complexity. The farm is the main asset. What about Patrice? Another pause. Patrice is on board. I thought about Patrice saying he told her it was preliminary. I thought about Patrice saying I told him that. I thought about the way my family worked, which was that Patrice's opinion registered as a note of concern that was heard and then factored out of the decision. I haven't agreed to anything, I said. I'm not asking you to agree to anything yet. I'm just keeping you informed. It's a family matter, Clara. We're all in this together. In this together. I let that sit for a moment. I have some things I need to sort out before I can have this conversation properly, I said. Give me until the end of the week. Diane wants to move fairly quickly. The fall market. The end of the week, Dad. A pause that contained some recalibration. He was not accustomed to me setting timelines. Fine, he said. But let's plan to talk Friday. Friday works, I said. I hung up and lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the end of the week. Thursday, Robert Harlan would come to the Colton building and update the appraisal. The representation letter from Fenn would be in my email by Wednesday. I had Bud Harlan's buyer list, all 14 names, waiting for the moment when the appraisal was in my hand and the documentation was complete. My father wanted to move quickly. Diane Birch wanted to move quickly. The fall market apparently had opinions about timing. My grandmother had spent 11 years not moving quickly, and the result was 7 pieces of machinery in a dry building with a current appraisal that I had not yet fully processed, sitting in a county where no one who wanted to rearrange things had any standing to touch them. I had until Friday to understand exactly what I was standing on. Wednesday evening, Finn's letter arrived in my email. 2 pages, formal letterhead, the tone of a document that has been drafted to be read by people who might want to dispute what it says and has been written to give them nothing to dispute. It confirmed the deed, the filing date, the parcel description, and my unencumbered ownership of the Colton property, including all structures and their contents. It directed any inquiries regarding the property to Whitlow and Finn. It was the kind of document that does not invite questions because there is nothing to question. I read it twice and then forwarded it to my own email with the subject line to keep on file. Robert Harlan arrived at the Colton building Thursday morning at 9. He drove a company truck with his firm's name on the side, parked at the end of the gravel track, and walked in with a camera bag and a notebook with the ease of someone who knew the building and was returning rather than arriving for the first time. He was in his late 40s, built like someone who spent time in buildings like this one by choice rather than necessity, and he shook my hand at the door and said his father had spoken well of me, which I appreciated. We spent 3 hours inside. He moved through the machines methodically, lifting tarps and replacing them with the same care I had used, photographing each piece from multiple angles, making notes on the condition of components and the preservation quality, comparing what he saw against his previous report. He found 2 things that had changed since his last visit. One of the tractors had developed a minor surface rust issue on a section of the frame that would need to be addressed before sale, and the threshing machine had been re-examined since his previous assessment after a specialist from Kentucky had inspected it and confirmed a detail about its manufacturing provenance that upgraded its category slightly. He spent the most time with the threshing machine. He was quiet while he worked, which I respected, and when he had finished his examination and was standing back from it with his notebook open, he said, without looking up from what he was writing, "Your grandfather knew what he was doing." "He did a lot of things I didn't know about," I said. Robert looked up. "Bud told me." He said Dale kept it separate on purpose, that he didn't want the collection to become a family argument while he was alive to watch it. He looked back at the machine. He was right that it would have been an argument. I thought about that. My grandfather had spent years building something of real value and had kept it entirely outside the family's awareness, not from secrecy for its own sake, but from a practical understanding of what happens to things when too many people know about them before the right person is ready to act. He had passed that understanding to Lottie, who had carried it another 11 years, and they had between them given me something that no one had been able to reach or rearrange or redirect in all that time. The people who built careful things, I was learning, tended to understand each other. "What's the updated range on the threshing machine?" I asked. He gave me the number. It was higher than what Bud had mentioned at the truck stop, which had already been higher than Harlan's previous report. The comparable auction data from the Kentucky spring sale had been analyzed further in the months since, and the consensus in the specialist market had settled at a number that was above the upper end of the previous estimate. I kept my face where it was and wrote the number in my notebook. "I'll have the full report to you by Monday," he said. "Signed, formatted, suitable for any purpose. I'll update the condition notes and the comp data for each of the 7 pieces." He paused. "My father asked me to mention that the Virginia buyer has reached out to him twice in the past month. He hasn't said anything about availability, but the interest is current and serious." "I'll call Bud when I have the report," I said. He nodded, replaced the last tarp, and we walked out into the October afternoon. The orchard was behind us, the old trees with their few remaining apples no one had come to pick, and the field to the right was going deeper into its autumn color, the scrub brush reddening at the edges. Robert photographed the exterior of the building and the cleared land and said the survey I had was recent enough to use, but that if I needed an updated one for any conveyance process he could recommend a firm. We shook hands at the end of the track and I watched his truck back out onto the county road, and then I stood there for a few minutes in the quiet. The 61 acres looked like nothing from the road. A mailbox with no name. A rusted survey stake. A gravel track disappearing into trees. Nothing to tell anyone who passed it what was at the far end. My grandfather had counted on that. I drove back to Cincinnati that afternoon. I had a shift Thursday night and another Friday afternoon, and the conversation with my father was scheduled for Friday evening, and I needed both shifts in between to do what shifts had always done for me, which was to clear the noise and leave only the things that were actually true. The cardiovascular unit on a Thursday night is its own kind of order. The patients in those beds are people whose hearts have done something unscheduled, a blockage, an arrhythmia, a valve that has been failing quietly for longer than anyone realized, and the work of caring for them is the work of watching for the next thing, being ready before it happens, having the right information at hand before it's needed. It is not dramatic work in the way that people who watch medical shows imagine. It is patient, repetitive, technically precise work that punishes shortcuts and rewards the kind of attention that does not wear out. I was good at it. I had always been good at it. And I thought about my grandmother while I worked, the way she had been patient with things, the apron on the hook every morning, the garden that required the same attention in the same sequence year after year, the building on the Colton parcel that needed to be checked and the log that needed to be updated and the calls to Fen that needed to be made, and all of it done without calling attention to itself, without announcing what it was for, just the quiet repetitive care of someone who understood that the things worth keeping require tending. She had tended this for 11 years. I finished my Thursday shift at 7 Friday morning, slept until noon, ate, and sat down at my kitchen table with my notebook and the photographs of Robert Harlan's previous report and the updated numbers from Thursday's walkthrough, and I did what I did with any situation that needed to be understood, which was to write it down in order. The Colton parcel. 61 acres. Deeded to me 11 years ago. Confirmed by county recording and by Fen's representation letter. The building. Timber frame, sound structure secure and dry. 7 machines in documented condition. The appraisal. Updated report due Monday. Conservative total from the existing figures plus Robert's Thursday numbers. The sum was a number that did not change the shape of a life entirely but changed the pressure of it, the way my grandmother's note had implied without saying. Enough handled correctly to do something real. The buyers. 14 names on Bud's list, 3 with active interest in threshing machines, 1 in Virginia who had been looking for 10 years. The legal position. Clear title, documented ownership. No connection to the farm estate. No one withstanding to dispute it. My father. Expecting a call at 6. I wrote it all down and looked at it and then I set down the pen and made a cup of coffee and stood at my kitchen window and watched the city do what cities do on a Friday afternoon, moving and rearranging itself without any particular awareness of what was happening 300 miles southeast of it in a kitchen in Cincinnati. The call with my father came at 6:15, which was 15 minutes late, which meant Renee was probably on the line with him, and they had been doing the last of their preparation before calling me. He started the way he always started things he had already decided, with information rather than questions. He said the estate filing was proceeding, that Fells and Chillicothe expected it to be straightforward, that the farm's title was clean and the probate process should move efficiently. He said Diane Birch had done a preliminary walkthrough of the property earlier in the week, which was the first I was hearing that. Diane Birch had been inside Lottie's farmhouse 4 days after Lottie's funeral. He said the farm showed well, the house was in good condition, the barn structure was sound, and that Diane expected strong interest from buyers looking for established agricultural land with a residence. He said he and Renee were thinking a late November listing, which would catch buyers who wanted to close before the end of the year. Then he said, "We'd like you and Patrice to sign off on the plan so we can move forward." I let a beat go by. "I need to tell you something," I said. He waited. "Lottie left something to me. Not through the estate. Separately 11 years ago." A pause. "What do you mean?" His voice was careful. "She deeded a separate parcel of land to me. 61 acres in Colton Township, with a building on it. The deed was filed with the county recorder 11 years ago, and is in my name. It's not part of the farm estate. It's not part of Mom's probate." The silence on his end was the silence of a man doing arithmetic. "I'm just hearing about this now," he said. "So am I. I found the deed in her apron pocket the night before the funeral." Another silence. Longer. "What's on this land?" "A building," I said. "With some things inside it." "What kind of things?" I thought about how to answer that. About the 7 tarps in their rows and the machine log in Dale's handwriting and the appraisal report sitting in a folder in my bag. About Bud Harlan waiting with his buyer list and Robert Harlan's report coming Monday and Thomas Fenn with his representation letter already filed. "Things she wanted me to handle," I said. "I have an attorney representing the property, and I'm in the process of understanding the full picture. I wanted you to know before anything moved forward with the farm." The silence this time was different. It was the silence of a man who had been moving toward something, and has just understood that the ground he thought he was moving on may not be what he assumed. "You have an attorney," he said. "Thomas Fenn at Whitlow and Fenn in the county seat." "I don't know that firm." Mom did, I said. He was quiet for a long moment. Clara. His voice had shifted into something that was trying to be reasonable and warm and was not quite making it. Whatever Mom left you, I'm sure it's meaningful. But we need to think about the family as a whole here. If there are assets that weren't disclosed that affects the estate, it affects how things get divided. The deed is 11 years old, I said. It's a completed transfer from a living owner to an adult child. It predates her death by 11 years. Finn will confirm this if you have any questions about the legal structure. We should all sit down together, he said. You, me, Renee, Patrice. Talk this through. I agree, I said. When the appraisal report comes in next week and I have the full picture, I'll share what I can share. Until then, I'd ask you to hold off on any formal steps with the farm. Not forever, just until we've had that conversation. A pause. The listing timeline is not more important than getting this right, I said. Finn would say the same thing. If you move too fast on the farm and there are questions later about whether all the family interests were understood, that creates problems for the estate. You don't want that. I heard him exhale. The sound of a man who has run a business and knows what it means when someone tells you to pause because the paperwork isn't complete. A week, he said. A week, I said. After we hung up, I sat for a long time at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold and my notebook open in front of me. The city was moving outside the window, the lights coming on as the evening settled, and I thought about Lottie at her kitchen table with her crossword puzzle, and the way the paramedics had said there was no struggle. She had simply stopped, and I hoped that in the last of her morning she had known that the thing she had built, intended, and kept separate for 11 years was intact and documented and waiting, and that the right person would find the key. I thought she had known. She had written 4 lines on notepaper with blue flowers and put them in an apron pocket and not added a word more than was needed, which was her way. She had trusted that what she had done was enough because she had done it carefully and completely, and because she had chosen the right person to do it for. I closed the notebook and put it in my bag. Monday morning, Robert Harlan's report arrived in my email at 8:47. I opened it at Bess's kitchen table with the coffee still hot and read it the way I read anything that matters, slowly from the beginning, not skipping to the summary. The report was 41 pages. Each machine had its own section: condition assessment, provenance documentation, comparable sales analysis, and a recommended value range for current market conditions. Robert's language was measured and professional, the language of a man who understood that the number he wrote on the page would be used in real conversations between real people about real money, and who took that responsibility seriously. I read each section. By the time I reached the threshing machines section, I had been reading for 40 minutes. The section was the longest, 12 pages, with photographs and the detailed manufacturing provenance that the Kentucky specialist had confirmed, and the comparable sales analysis that traced the movement of values in this category over the previous 3 years. Robert had included a note about the Virginia buyer, not by name but describing the profile, a serious long-term collector with documented purchases in the relevant category and the financial capacity to act without requiring financing, which in the specialty equipment market mattered because cash buyers could close quickly and with fewer conditions. The appraised range for the threshing machine alone in Robert's current assessment was substantial. The conservative end was the number that would have taken me 8 years to save as a nurse in Cincinnati. The upper end was 1.5 times that. I read it twice and then set my phone face down on the table. My grandfather had found it in a barn in Muskingum County in 2004. He had outbid Bud Harlan on the first machine at a Guernsey County farm auction in 1998 by $40. He had spent 15 years acquiring and restoring and storing, driving back roads and attending sales and building a relationship with a man who knew the market, keeping the whole enterprise in a building on 61 acres that his wife had deeded to their granddaughter 8 years before his wife died 11 years ago, when the granddaughter was 20 years old and did not know any of it existed. The total appraised value, conservative range, all 7 machines, was more than 3 times the asking price of the farm my father was planning to list by November. I sat with that number in the morning quiet of my apartment and I thought about my grandmother carrying her key in her apron pocket, and I felt something that was not triumph and was not grief but was the specific feeling of understanding finally and completely what someone had done for you and why, and knowing that the understanding had come in time to mean something. I called Bud Harlan. He picked up on the second ring. I told him the appraisal was in and gave him the summary numbers. He was quiet for a moment, which was his way of processing things he had expected but was still absorbing. Robert's being conservative, he said, which was not a criticism. The spring comps came in higher than he's using. But conservative is the right approach for documentation purposes. The Virginia buyer, I said. How serious is he? As serious as someone who has been looking for 10 years and has the resources to stop looking, Bud said. His name is Philip Garrett. He's built a working farm museum in the Shenandoah Valley over the past 15 years, operational exhibits the machines run. He's not a collector in the storage sense. He restores to function and he's willing to pay for pieces that don't need extensive work. A pause. The threshing machine your grandfather restored is exactly what Garrett has been looking for. The provenance documentation, the mechanical quality, all of it. What would he pay? At the high end of Robert's range or above, Bud said. Possibly above if the mechanical inspection confirms what the appraisal describes. Another pause. Your grandfather's restoration work was exceptional, Clara. I watched him do most of it. He had the patience for it and the precision. Garrett will recognize that. I looked at the appraisal report on my phone. 41 pages of careful documentation representing 23 years of a man's quiet, deliberate work. I want to call the family meeting first, I said. Before I talk to any buyers. They need to understand the situation before anything moves forward. That's the right order, Bud said. When the meeting happens and you're ready to reach out to Garrett, I'll make the introduction. I thanked him and set the phone down and sat for a while in the morning light coming through my apartment window. The family meeting was going to be the hardest part. Not because I was afraid of it, but because there was no version of it that was entirely easy. No way to sit across from my father and my aunts and tell them what I knew that did not involve watching them understand something that would rearrange their calculations entirely. My father had been planning a real estate timeline. Renee had been assuming an inheritance she had shaped her thinking around. Even Patrice, who had been careful and honest and had held my hand through the hymns, would need time to absorb what Lottie had done and why. And the why was the part that would land hardest. Not the deed, not the acreage, not the machines or the appraised values. The why. The 11 years of keeping it separate. The 4 lines on notepaper. The choice that Lottie had made and documented and kept in an apron pocket until it could be found by the person she had decided to trust with it. That was the thing that would sit in the room between us long after the meeting was over. I picked up my phone and called Patrice. She answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting for me to call. I'm ready to tell you, I said. I know, she said. I've been waiting. Can you come to Cincinnati? I think this needs to be in person. A pause. When? Wednesday, I said. Before I talked to Dad. She said she would be there. Patrice arrived Wednesday at noon in a green Subaru with a cracked windshield and a bag of apples from a farm stand she had stopped at on the way up from Zanesville. She stood in my apartment doorway and looked at me the way she had been looking at me since we were children, the reading look, the look that was taking inventory before deciding what was needed. She handed me the apples without comment and came inside and sat at my kitchen table and waited. I made coffee. I put the apples in the bowl on the counter. I sat across from her and opened my notebook and told her everything in order. From the apron pocket to the notepaper to the county recorder's office to the building on the Colton parcel to the machine log and the metal box and the appraiser's report that had arrived Monday morning. I showed her the photographs on my phone. I read her the 4 lines in Lottie's handwriting. I told her the total appraised value from Robert Harlan's report, conservative range, and I watched her face move through the information the way water moves through a landscape, finding the lowest point, settling into the shape of things. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Outside my window, the city went about its business. A bus stopped and started. Somewhere below us, someone was delivering something heavy, and the sound of the dolly on the sidewalk came up through the glass in small irregular impacts. She chose you, Patrice said. Not with bitterness. With something more like recognition, the sound of a fact being accepted that had been suspected for a long time. She did, I said. Dale would have too. She looked at her coffee. I knew something was different about how she thought of you. I never knew what it was exactly. She would say things sometimes. About how you were going to be all right. Not in the way you say it about someone you're worried about. In the way you say it about someone you've already made arrangements for. I thought about that. She never told you anything about the Colton land? Nothing. She shook her head. I didn't know it existed. The Colton name doesn't mean anything to me. Dale's mother's family, you said? According to Finn. He said it was land that came through Dale's mother's side and had been held separately from the main farm. Lottie acquired it outright after Dale died, and then transferred it to me the following year. Patrice was quiet again. Then she said, Gordon is going to be angry. I know. Not just surprised. Angry. She looked at me directly. You understand that, right? He's going to feel like she chose you over him. And Renee will follow his lead because she always does. And the anger is going to look like legal argument or fairness argument or family argument, but underneath it's going to be about the fact that his mother looked at all 3 of her children and made a choice and he wasn't it. I had thought about this. I had thought about it on the drive back from Borden's Mill, and on both overnight shifts and in the mornings when I woke up earlier than I needed to and lay in the dark turning the shape of the coming conversation over in my mind. I know, I said. What are you going to do with it? She said. The land and the machines. After. Sell the machines through the right buyers, the ones on Bud Harlan's list. There's a collector in Virginia who's been looking for the threshing machine specifically. The other pieces have their own buyers in the network. I paused. The land I haven't decided yet. It could be leased for the timber on the western edge or held. Fenn says it has agricultural potential if someone wanted to clear the scrub parcels. And the money. I'm still thinking about that, I said. But some of it goes back into nursing. There's a scholarship program I want to put funding into, for LPN students who are covering their own costs without family support. I looked at the coffee. I applied for every grant available when I was in school. I got 2 of them and they mattered more than I can explain. Someone funded those. I didn't know who at the time. Patrice looked at me for a long moment. She would have liked that. I think so. We sat with that for a while. The bus outside stopped and started again. The delivery person was gone. Tell me what you need from me, Patrice said, which was the most Patrice thing she had ever said. I need you in the room on Friday, I said. When I tell Dad and Renee. Not to defend me. Just to be a witness to what's said. She nodded once. I'll be there. I had asked my father and Renee to come to Borden's Mill on Friday evening for the conversation I had promised him. I had not told them what it was about beyond that I had something to share about Mom's estate that I needed to discuss in person before any further steps were taken on the farm. My father had agreed in the tone of a man who was agreeing because there was no graceful way not to, and Renee had agreed in the tone of a woman who had already been briefed by my father and had her responses prepared. I drove down Thursday evening, stayed at the same motel on Route 33, and drove out to the Colton building Friday morning alone. I unlocked the small entry door and went inside and stood in the center of the building among the 7 covered machines and let the quiet settle around me. The October light came through the high south windows and lay in pale rectangles on the dirt floor. And the smell of dry wood and clean metal was there the same as always, unchanged by anything that had happened in the weeks since I first stood in this spot and understood what I was looking at. I thought about my grandfather at a farm auction in Guernsey County in 1998. Bidding against a stranger on a piece of old machinery because something about it had called to him. I thought about the 40 years before that, the things he had built and repaired and maintained and passed on, the bench seat in the truck and the AM radio that only got 2 stations and the hands he used for everything from setting fence posts to checking my field hockey schedule in the program I handed him at the gate. I thought about the way he had listened, always leaning forward slightly, one hand around a coffee mug, not checking his watch. He had spent 23 years building something for me in this building, and he had not lived to see me stand in it. I stayed for about an hour. I did not lift any tarps or open the metal box. I just stood in the quiet and let myself be where I was, which was the building my grandfather had built into and my grandmother had kept and which was now mine, completely and legally and without condition, on a 61-acre piece of ground in Colton Township that had been mine for 11 years before I knew it. When I left, I locked the door and put the key in my jacket pocket and drove back toward Borden's Mill for the last time before everything changed. The meeting was at my father's house in Chillicothe, not at the farm. He had suggested his own house, which I had agreed to because it was neutral ground in the sense that it was his territory and I was coming to him, which gave him a kind of comfort and control that I was willing to let him have for the duration of the conversation. The kitchen table there was oval and dark wood and large enough for 5 people without anyone feeling crowded. And when I arrived at 6, Renee was already there with her husband Brian, and Patrice had driven up from Zanesville and was sitting at the counter with a glass of water looking at her phone. My father was at the stove. He had made chili, which was what he made when he was trying to normalize a conversation, give it the texture of an ordinary evening, food and family at a table. I appreciated the instinct even if I understood what it was doing. We ate. The conversation during the meal was the conversation of people who know something else is coming and are filling the space before it with the reasonable commerce of ordinary life. How was the drive? How is work? Have you heard from the neighbors about the Borden's Mill house sale 2 roads over? I contributed to it because it cost nothing and because it was not dishonest, just incomplete. After the plates were cleared and Brian had excused himself to the living room with the particular tact of a man who knew he was not supposed to be in this particular conversation, my father folded his hands on the table and looked at me and said, "All right, Clara." I had the folder with me. Fenn's representation letter on top, the certified deed copy behind it, and a 1-page summary I had written myself that laid out the key facts in the order they would be needed. I set the folder on the table in front of me but did not open it yet. "You both know that Lottie died without any warning," I said. "She was at the kitchen table with her crossword puzzle and she was gone." I paused. She had been planning for that for a long time. Not the exact moment, but for what would come after it. My father was watching me. Renee was watching the folder. I told them about the apron pocket, the envelope, the deed. I told them about the Colton parcel and the building and the machines. I told them about the machine log in Dale's handwriting going back to 1998, and the note in Lottie's handwriting from 3 years ago, and the key on the tag with the word shed. I told them about Bud Harlan and Robert Harlan and Thomas Fenn, the 3 people who had known about this for years and had been maintaining their respective roles quietly until the right time. I told them the filing date on the deed. Then I told them the appraised value. The room was silent for a moment that was longer than it felt. My father's face went through several things in quick succession. The first was the face of a man hearing information he was processing purely as information, before the implications arrived. The second was the face of the implications arriving. The third was a stillness that settled over the first 2 and stayed there. A controlled stillness, the face of a man who ran a business and knew how to wait before he spoke. Renee spoke first. 11 years ago, she said. Her voice was careful. Mom transferred land to you 11 years ago and didn't tell anyone. She told Thomas Fenn, I said. And she told Bud Harlan, who had been working with Dad for years on the machines. I paused. She chose to tell them because they needed to know in order to do their jobs. She chose not to tell the family because she understood what would happen if she did. What does that mean? Renee said. Her voice had moved past careful. It means she understood her family, I said. Not unkindly. As flat as I could make it. She understood what happens when an asset becomes visible to people who are in financial difficulty. She saw what was happening clearly, and she made her decision about who to trust with it. Renee looked at my father. My father looked at the table. The deed is 11 years old, he said finally, in the voice of someone who has done some arithmetic and is now checking it. That's before the business trouble. Before Brian's investment. Yes, I said. So she made this decision before any of that. Yes. Another silence. He was recalibrating and I could see him doing it, the way a practical man recalibrates when the ground he thought he was standing on turns out to have different properties than he assumed. She was planning this from the start, he said. From the year after Dad died. I think she had been thinking about it longer than that, I said. But that's when she acted. He was quiet for a long time. Patrice sat at the corner of the table and watched us both and did not speak. Renee said, "This isn't fair." I had expected that sentence. I had rehearsed my response to it for 2 days and still was not entirely sure what the right response was, because the sentence was both completely understandable and completely wrong, and those 2 things had to be held at the same time. She had the legal right to do it, I said. The deed was properly executed and filed. Fenn will confirm that any inquiry into the transaction will find a clean, straightforward property transfer from a living owner with full legal capacity to a named adult child. There is no mechanism to challenge it. I'm not talking about the legal right, Renee said. I'm talking about fairness. She had 3 children. She chose one of them. I looked at her for a moment. Renee was not a cruel person. She was a person in financial stress whose mother had just died, and who had been expecting an inheritance that would help cover a gap, and who had just been told that the most valuable thing her mother owned had been given away 11 years ago to someone else. The emotion on her face was real. She did choose, I said. She made a specific choice and she documented it, and she kept it safe for 11 years and she left it for me to find. I don't know everything she was thinking, but she wrote 4 lines on a piece of notepaper, and one of them said she chose me because she believed I was the one who wouldn't let anyone talk me out of it. I paused. I think she trusted me with it because she knew I would handle it the way she and Dale had handled it, carefully and without letting it become a weapon. Renee looked at the table. "You're not going to share any of it," she said. It was not quite a question. I had thought about this more than I had thought about anything else in the preceding weeks. It had not been a simple question. I had turned it over from every direction, sitting in my car at truck stops and parking lots and at my kitchen table in the pre-dawn hours after night shifts. The deed was mine. The law was clear. I owed no one any portion of what my grandmother had built and kept for me. But the answer was not simple, and I was not going to pretend it was. "Dad," I said, "I know the business has been struggling." He looked up. "If it comes to a point where things are genuinely critical, I want you to call me. Not through Finn, not through attorneys. Call me." I looked at him. "She was your mother too. And Dale was your father. What they built partly for you, for their children's lives. I'm not going to pretend that's nothing." He was very still. "I'm not making commitments tonight," I said. "I'm not signing anything tonight. But I want you to know that I heard what she was trying to do, which was keep this out of the hands of urgency and fear, and I intend to handle it that way. When I have a clearer picture of what the sales look like and what the land is worth, I'll have another conversation. About what makes sense. About what she actually would have wanted for all of you." Renee said nothing. She was looking at her hands. "Patrice," I said. Patrice looked at me. "Same." She nodded once. My father cleared his throat. It was the sound of a man who had expected one conversation and received a different one, and was locating himself in the new terrain. He looked older than he had at the funeral, which had been 12 days ago, which was not very long. His business was struggling and his mother was dead, and his daughter had just told him that the thing he had not known existed was real and documented and belonged to someone who was not him, and the response he had prepared for the evening had not prepared him for any of this. "The farm," he said. "The listing." "That's your business," I said. "Yours and Renee's and Patrice's. The farm goes through the estate and the estate will be distributed according to the will. I'm not going to interfere with that." "You're not a beneficiary," he said. Not as an accusation. As a fact he was confirming. "No," I said. "She left the farm to the 3 of you equally." I paused. "She left me what she left me." He looked at the table for a long time. Then he said in a voice that was tired rather than angry, "She always did see you differently." "She saw all of us," I said. "She just saw us specifically. The way she saw things. The way she kept the garden and repainted the shutters. She looked at things carefully and she made her decisions carefully." He was quiet. "She loved you," I said. "All 3 of you. I know that." He did not respond, but something in his face changed, a small change, the kind you see in a patient when the pain level shifts from acute to manageable, the face resettling around a different weight. Renee stood up and took her plate to the sink and stood with her back to the room for a moment and then turned around and her eyes were wet but her voice was level. "The Diane Birch listing," she said. "Take your time with it," I said. "Do it right. Get a good price." She nodded once and went to find Brian in the living room. Patrice drove back to Zanesville that night and my father walked me to my car at 8:30. The night was cold and clear and the first stars were out above the neighborhoods of Chillicothe, the ordinary neighborhood dark punctuated by porch lights and the blue flicker of televisions through windows. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and did not say much for a moment. "She gave you a key," he said. "In the apron pocket." He almost smiled. It was a thin smile, the smile of a man recognizing something about someone he had known all his life. "That's Mom," he said. "It is," I said. He squeezed my arm, the same gesture he had used after the funeral, and went back inside. I sat in my car for a few minutes in his driveway and then drove back to the motel and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and let the evening settle. I had not expected it to feel the way it felt, which was not triumphant and not relieved exactly, but something closer to the way a long shift feels in the hour after you finish it, when the urgency is gone and what remains is the quiet fact of having done what needed to be done steadily without shortcuts, without anyone getting hurt who did not need to be. My grandmother had spent 11 years setting something in motion. I had spent 3 weeks understanding it. The conversation tonight was the last piece of the preparation. Now came the actual work. Philip Garrett was in Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley, on a farm he had been building into a working agricultural museum for 15 years. Bud Harlan had told me about the place in our second phone call. A November morning when I was between shifts and had called him with questions about the sequencing of the sales. He described it the way you describe something you have seen and respected, an operational farm with working equipment from 3 different agricultural eras, each machine maintained in running condition by a small staff of mechanics who had been specifically trained for the work. Garrett was not a collector who stored things in climate-controlled rooms and attended auctions twice a year. He was a man who wanted the machines to run, who wanted people to see and hear and understand what they were, who had been building a context around each piece he acquired rather than simply acquiring it. My grandfather would have approved of that. Bud made the introduction by phone on a Wednesday in early November, 3 weeks after the family meeting. He called Garrett first, told him I would be reaching out, and then called me and gave me Garrett's number and said he's been waiting for this call, Clara. Go ahead when you're ready. I called from my car in the hospital parking lot after a day shift, which was the most available 12 minutes I had on that particular day. Garrett picked up on the third ring. His voice was the voice of a man in his early 60s who had made a great deal of money doing something unrelated to agriculture, and had spent the past 15 years converting that money into something that satisfied him more, deliberate and specific and not in a hurry. He said Bud had told him about the machine and about the documentation and about the provenance, and his voice when he said it had the quality of a man trying to remain professionally measured about something he was not professionally measured about. I told him what was in the appraisal. I told him about the machine log and the restoration history, and the Kentucky specialist's assessment of the manufacturing provenance. I told him the building had been dry and secure for the life of the storage. He asked 2 specific mechanical questions that I answered from the appraisal notes Robert had shared with me about the threshing machine's operational status, and his questions confirmed what Bud had told me, that this was a man who understood what he was looking at and was not going to be moved by anything other than the actual condition of the actual machine. I told him the appraised range. He said he would be above it. He said it the way Bud had predicted, without negotiation, because he had been looking for 10 years and the waiting had become its own kind of cost. We agreed that he would come to Colton Township the following week with his farm manager, a man named Cal who handled all mechanical assessments for the museum acquisitions, and that the visit would be a full inspection, operational assessment, and if everything matched the documentation we would discuss terms from there. I called Finn after I hung up and told him to expect a purchase offer within 10 days. He said your grandmother would be pleased. Garrett arrived on a Tuesday with Cal, who was a quiet man in his 50s with mechanic's hands and a stillness about him that reminded me of Bud Harlan, the stillness of someone who speaks most clearly through what they do rather than what they say. They spent 4 hours in the building. Garrett walked the machine twice while Cal went through it systematically, checking mechanisms and belts and the condition of the castings and the quality of the restoration work with the focused attention of someone who was not going to be wrong about this. I stood back and let them work. At the end of the 4 hours, Cal and Garrett spoke quietly near the front doors for about 5 minutes. Then Garrett came to where I was standing and shook my hand. The restoration is exactly what the documentation says, he said. Your grandfather's work is exceptional. Cal says whoever did the rebuilding understood the machine as a system, not just a collection of parts. He had help, I said. Bud Harlan sourced most of the replacement components. Bud told me. He looked back at the machine, still uncovered, the full length of it visible in the afternoon light coming through the high windows. I've been looking for this specific model for a decade. The other known operational example is in a private collection in Ohio and the owner has no interest in selling. He paused. This is the one. He offered the top of Robert Harlan's updated range. I said I would consult with Fenn and respond by the end of the week. He said he understood and thanked me for the viewing and shook my hand again, and he and Cal drove back down the gravel track toward the county road. And I stood in the doorway of the building and watched them go and felt the particular quality of the moment, which was the moment when something that has been prepared and tended and kept safe for a very long time begins to move toward the purpose it was built for. I called Bud Harlan from the doorway. He picked up on the second ring. "Top of the range," I said. A pause. Then the short sound he made when something had gone the way it should have gone. "Dale would have liked Philip Garrett," he said. "I think so too," I said. The sale of the threshing machine closed 6 weeks later, in mid-December, through a process that Fenn described as one of the cleaner transactions he had handled in 20 years of estate and property work, which was a compliment I understood to be directed as much at my grandfather's documentation practices as at anything I had done. The machine log, the acquisition records, the provenance chain, the original appraisal and the updated one, all of it was in order, each piece fitting the next the way a well-built thing fits together without gaps or improvised explanations. Garrett's team came with a specialized flatbed truck and rigging equipment, and spent half a day removing the threshing machine from the building with a care that matched the care it had been stored with. I was there for the loading. Bud was there too, which seemed right. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and watched without saying much, and when the machine was secured on the flatbed and the truck was ready to pull out, he turned to me and said, "That's the last one your grandfather found and the best one he found." And I said, "I know," and we stood together while the truck went down the gravel track and out onto the county road. The proceeds from the threshing machine sale were the largest single number I had ever had occasion to think about in relation to myself. After Fenn's fee and the applicable taxes and a modest reserve against future transactions, what remained was a sum that I deposited into an account I had opened specifically for the Colton proceeds, separate from my regular accounts, because that was the right way to hold it until I understood what I intended to do with it. I understood roughly what I intended to do with it. The first call I made after the closing was to the scholarship office at the nursing school I had attended in Columbus. I had looked into their need-based award program 2 weeks earlier and had spoken with the development officer, a woman named Gina who had the particular quality of someone who has spent years asking for money and has learned to be grateful without being performative about it. I told her I wanted to make a gift to support LPN students who were covering their own tuition without family assistance. I gave her the number I had in mind for the initial endowment. She was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone checking whether they had heard correctly. I said it again. She said that would fund approximately 4 full scholarships per year at current tuition levels, and I said that would be a start. I did not name the fund after myself. I named it after Dale and Lottie Marsh, because the money was theirs in the only sense that mattered, the sense of whose work and whose patience and whose careful long-term thinking had made it real. The school put their names on a small plaque in the financial aid office, which I did not attend the unveiling of because I was working a Tuesday night shift, which felt like the right thing to be doing. The other 6 machines sold over the course of the following 8 months, each one to a buyer from Bud's list, each sale handled through Fenn's office with the same clean documentation that the threshing machine sale had established. The 2 tractors went to a collector in Iowa, who ran a working farm museum similar to Garrett's and had been in correspondence with Bud for years about exactly this category of equipment. The 3rd tractor and the small hay baler went to a buyer in Indiana. The remaining 2 pieces went to buyers in separate states, one in Pennsylvania and one in Kentucky. Each sale Bud Harlan stood somewhere nearby. At the Iowa sale, he drove 3 hours to be present for the loading. I asked him afterward why he kept coming and he said, "Because your grandfather would have come, and I wanted to make sure someone was there who understood what each one of them cost and what they were worth and what it meant that they were going somewhere good." I did not have a sufficient answer to that, so I said thank you, and he said, "Don't thank me, kid, your grandfather did the work, I just knew what it was worth." By the following October, 11 months after I had stood in my grandmother's bedroom and found an envelope in an apron pocket, all 7 machines had been sold, the Colton building was empty and swept, and the 61 acres were mine in a different sense than they had been at the start, mine not as a theoretical inheritance but as a working consideration. A piece of ground with timber on the western edge and cleared land that had been fallow for years and an orchard with 30 trees that had been producing apples that no one was picking. I had been thinking about the orchard. A colleague of mine at the hospital, a pharmacist named Deanna who grew up on a fruit farm in western Ohio and still drove out twice a year to help with the harvest, had mentioned once that small cider operations were doing well in that part of the state, that the consumer interest in local production had created a genuine market for the kind of orchard fruit that used to just rot on the ground because the processing infrastructure wasn't there. She had said it casually, in the break room over terrible coffee, and I had filed it in the part of my mind where I put things I was not ready to think about yet. I called her in November. We drove out to Colton Township on a Saturday morning, the two of us in my car with coffee in a thermos, and I showed her the orchard and the cleared land in the building, empty now, smelling of dry wood and the specific clean absence of things that had been stored and then removed. Deanna walked the orchard rows with the eye of someone who had grown up reading fruit trees the way other people read text and told me that 8 of the 30 trees were likely recoverable to productive status with proper pruning, and that the cleared land east of the orchard was suitable for expanding the planting if I wanted to go further. She used the word investment the way farmers use it, meaning a commitment of time and attention and patience before anything comes back. I had been investing that way my whole life without knowing what to call it. I did not decide everything that morning. I am not a person who makes fast decisions about things that matter. But I drove back towards Cincinnati that afternoon with the sun coming through the windshield at the low November angle, and the thermos between the seats and Deanna talking about rootstock varieties and drainage patterns, and I felt something I had not let myself feel very much in 31 years, which was the possibility of a life that was not built around absence and distance and the management of other people's expectations, but around something I had chosen and could point to and say, this is mine. I built this not from nothing, from what someone gave me, and what I did with it was what they believed I would do. The farm my father listed in November sold in January for $370,000, which was strong for the market and which Diane Birch celebrated with the particular satisfaction of a real estate agent who had priced something correctly. The 3 siblings divided the proceeds equally after the estate costs. My father's share was enough to stabilize the business for the near term. He called me after the closing with the news, and his voice was different from the voice in any of the earlier calls, not warmer exactly, but settled, the voice of a man who had resolved something. He asked how things were going with the Colton land. I told him the machines had all sold and that I was thinking about the orchard. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad always liked that orchard." I had not known my grandfather had been to the Colton property at all, had not known my father knew it existed. I asked him what he meant. He said, "When I was a kid, maybe 10 or 11, Dad took me out there once. He said it was land that had been in the family a long time and he wanted me to see it. I didn't think much about it. I forgot about it honestly until you told us about the deed. I thought about Dale driving a 10-year-old Gordon out to Colton Township to see the land that had been in the family a long time. Wanting him to see it, wanting someone to know it was there. He had built things for the long term. He had passed that understanding to Lottie. Lottie had spent 11 years carrying it, and keeping it safe and putting it in the hands of the person she believed would know what to do with it. And here I was. I call Patrice every week now. Not because we made a formal decision about it, but because it happened naturally in the months after the family meeting, the calls getting closer together until they were weekly, on Sunday evenings mostly, while I am finishing dinner and she is in her kitchen in Zanesville doing whatever she is doing, and we talk about ordinary things and occasionally about the farm and occasionally about Lottie, and the calls do not feel like maintenance, they feel like what they are, which is 2 people who have always understood each other, finding, in the aftermath of loss, that the understanding is still there and does not require explanation. She came out to the Colton building once in March, when the snow was still on the ground in the shadows and the orchard trees were beginning to show the first faint green of the year. We walked the property in the cold with our coats on, and I showed her the cleared land and the orchard and told her what Deanna had said about the recoverable trees, and she listened with the focused listening she brings to things that matter to her. At the end of the orchard row she stopped and looked back at the building and the cleared field and the tree line on the western edge where the timber stood, and she said, they knew what they were doing. She said they, not she, which was how I had come to think about it too. Dale who had built and Lottie who had kept. 2 people who had worked together for 50 years and understood the same things about patience and careful preparation and what it means to build something for someone you love, which is that you build it to last past your own ability to protect it. You build it so well and so cleanly that it does not need your protection anymore, and you put the key in the hands of the person you trust and you leave. I found out in the spring from Bud Harlan, who found out from someone in the network, that Philip Garrett had the threshing machine operational by April. He had invited a group of agricultural history students from a university in Virginia to come and see it run, And it had run, and the students had stood and watched it with the expressions of people witnessing something they had only ever read about, the actual physical fact of a machine from another era doing what it was built to do. Bud said Garrett had told him the restoration quality was why it ran so well, that whoever had done the work had understood the machine not just mechanically but in the sense of what it was for, and that made the difference between a machine that works and a machine that works right. I thought about Dale in this building in the years before his stroke. Coming out on Tuesday mornings, driving the Ford with the bench seat and the AM radio, unlocking the door and standing among the covered machines and doing what needed doing slowly and carefully, with the patience of a man who understood that certain things require the long view. I thought about what it had cost him and what he had expected in return, which was nothing, which was the point. I am still a nurse at St. Vincent. I work nights and I cover shifts and I do the work that I am good at and that matters in ways that do not always show. I am also, on certain weekends, driving back to Colton Township, where the orchard is being brought back into production by a woman named Deanna, who has taken a leave of absence from the hospital to run what she is calling a trial season, one part-time cider operation on recovered land, and I am her logistical support and her co-investor and the person who owns the ground and who drives out on Saturday mornings with coffee and a thermos to walk the orchard rows and see what is happening. What is happening is, the 8 recoverable trees have been pruned and are producing. The first processing equipment arrived in September, and is stored in the building that used to hold 7 covered machines, and now holds the beginning of something else entirely. The first small batch of cider is scheduled for late autumn, which is when apples are ready and not before, because that is how it works. You cannot rush the part that requires time. I have Lottie's apron on a hook in my apartment. The 3 of them, actually, the canvas ones and the kitchen cotton ones, taken from the hook in her bedroom the night before the funeral. They hang on the same kind of hook behind the door of my bedroom, where I see them when I come in and when I leave. The pocket on the bottom apron is empty now. I think about her every morning. She was 79 years old and she had spent 11 of those years carrying something for me in that pocket, something she had built with Dale and then maintained alone, through the seasons and the gradual changes and the slow progress of time, tending it the way she tended the vegetable garden and the apple trees and the shutters that needed repainting every 5 years whether they needed it or not, with the quiet constant attention of someone who understood that the things worth keeping require the kind of care that does not announce itself and does not ask to be thanked and does not stop. She had left me a key. She had left me 61 acres and a building and 7 covered machines and a notebook in her husband's handwriting and 4 lines on notepaper with small blue flowers, and underneath all of it, the thing she had really left me, which was the understanding that the ground could be solid if the right person had been tending it, and that the right person had been tending it, and that the right person was me. I carry the brass key on my ring now between my apartment key and my car key, where I feel it every time I reach into my pocket. The tag is still there, the ink still faded, the single word still legible if you hold it in good light. Shed. She knew I would find it. She had always known I would find it. That was enough. That had always been enough. The first batch of cider was ready on a Saturday in late October, which was a year and 18 days after I had found the envelope in my grandmother's apron pocket. Deanna had been out at the Colton building since 6 in the morning, when I arrived at 9 with 2 thermoses and a bag of pastries from the bakery on 5th Street that I passed on my way out of Cincinnati. The processing equipment was running, a modest setup by commercial standards but correct for what we were doing, and the smell that came out of the building when I opened the door was something I had not expected, sharp and alive and sweetly fermented, the smell of fruit becoming something else, which is one of the oldest transformations agriculture has to offer, and which hit me in the chest in a way I could not have predicted. Deanna looked up from where she was monitoring a valve and grinned. "First pull," she said. The yield was small. 8 of the recovered trees at their first productive season post-pruning, supplemented by fruit from the 4 trees that had never stopped bearing, and the total volume was what Deanna called a proof-of-concept batch, enough to understand what we had and whether it was worth continuing. She had been talking for weeks about the particular quality of older apple varieties, the ones that had been growing in that orchard since before either of us were born, and how the character of the fruit would come through in the cider in ways that modern commercial varieties did not produce. I tasted it from a small cup she poured at noon. It was good. Not good the way something is good when you want it to be good and adjust your perception accordingly. Good in a specific verifiable way, the way a lab result is good, the way a clean chart is good. There was something in it that tasted like the orchard in October, which sounds like something a person says when they are being sentimental, but which was in this case a literal description of what I was tasting, the particular combination of those trees and that ground in that season. Deanna watched my face. Yeah, she said, which was her way of confirming what she already knew. We spent the rest of the afternoon labeling the bottles. A simple design Deanna had worked out with a friend who did small batch label printing, cream-colored paper with clean type and the orchard address and the year. No brand name yet, just the address and the apple varieties and the year of production. I had not decided on a name and Deanna had not pushed me, because she understood, without my saying so, that the name would come when it came and that forcing it was not the right approach. I drove back to Cincinnati that evening with 4 bottles in a bag on the passenger seat and the smell of the cider still on my jacket and the particular exhaustion of a day that had required nothing clinical from me. No monitoring, no charting, no calculation of dosage or timing, just presence and attention and the willingness to be somewhere long enough to watch something happen. I had not had very many days like that. I put 1 bottle on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a while before I went to bed. The complication arrived 6 weeks later, in the first week of December, in the form of a letter. Not an email. A letter, actual paper in an actual envelope, addressed to Clara Marsh at the Colton Township Rural Route address, which meant whoever sent it had pulled the deed from the county recorder's office the same way I had, which told me something about the nature of the inquiry before I opened it. The return address was a law firm in Columbus, Hargrove and Stills, with a suite number in a building downtown that I recognized as the kind of building that housed firms doing transactional work rather than the unglamorous county-level work that Thomas Fenn did, larger, more polished, operating in a different register. I opened it at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning before a night shift. The letter was 2 pages, professional in tone, and it said the following, in the careful language of attorneys who have been instructed to make an inquiry that the client wants to appear reasonable. It said that the firm represented a party with an interest in agricultural land in Colton Township, Hester County, Ohio. It said that the party had become aware of the Colton parcel and its recent activity, the phrase recent activity doing the work of acknowledging without specifying what they knew. It said the party believed they had a potential claim to a portion of the parcel based on a prior agreement, unrecorded, between the party and the late Dale Marsh regarding the use and eventual disposition of the eastern portion of the property. An unrecorded agreement with Dale Marsh, who had been dead for 11 years. I read the letter twice. Then I set it on the table and sat back and thought about it with the same stillness I use in the unit when a monitor shows something unexpected, the stillness before action, the moment of reading the data before deciding what it means. The letter named the party in the 3rd paragraph. A man named Warren All, who was described as a longtime neighbor and associate of Dale Marsh in Hester County, who had entered into a verbal agreement with Dale Marsh in or around 2003 regarding the right to purchase the eastern 20 acres of the Colton parcel at a below-market price in the event of any future sale. A verbal agreement. From 2003. With a man who had been dead since 2012. I called Thomas Fenn before I left for my shift. He answered on the 2nd ring and listened to me read the letter aloud without interrupting. When I finished he was quiet for a moment, the focusing quiet, and then he said, Warren All. You know him. I know of him, Fenn said. He owned the property adjacent to the eastern boundary of the Colton parcel for about 15 years. He sold it in 2019 to a development company out of Columbus that has been sitting on it since. A pause. That development company is almost certainly who Hargrove and Stills represents, not All himself. All would be the vehicle for the claim. I thought about that. A development company that had been sitting on adjacent land for 5 years, and had recently become aware of activity on the parcel next to it. Activity meaning a cider operation. Meaning a functional business on land that had previously appeared dormant. Can they make this claim? I said. An unrecorded verbal agreement from 2003 with a deceased party, Fenn said, is about as thin as a legal claim gets. But thin is not the same as zero, and the cost of defending against even a weak claim in court is real, which is what they're counting on. He paused. This is a pressure move. They want you to either sell the eastern acreage voluntarily at a favorable price or spend money on litigation that makes the voluntary sale look attractive by comparison. What's on the eastern acreage? Mostly the cleared land, he said. The old furrow fields. And the access road. The access road. The gravel track that ran from the county road through the tree line to the building and the orchard. If the eastern 20 acres included the access road, losing it would not end the operation but would require finding a new access point through the timber on the western edge, which would be expensive and disruptive and would take time that the orchard did not have to spare in the middle of a growing season. They had done their survey before they sent the letter. "What do I need to do?" I said. "First, nothing," Fenn said. "You do not respond to Hargrove and Stills directly, or through any channel other than this office. Second, I need to pull the full title chain on the eastern acreage and verify that there is no recorded instrument of any kind that supports a right of first refusal or purchase option. Third, I need to speak with anyone who has knowledge of Dale's actual dealings with Warren All." He paused. "And fourth, you need to call Bud Harlan. Bud would know." "Bud knew Dale's business better than anyone living," Fenn said. "If there was an agreement of any kind with Warren All, Bud either knows about it or knows that it didn't exist." I called Bud from the hospital parking lot before I went in for my shift. He answered on the second ring as he always did and listened to me describe the letter with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. Not passive, not waiting, but present and absorbing. When I finished he said, "Warren All." "Yes." A silence that was different from his usual silence. Longer, with something in it. "Warren All tried to buy the eastern acreage from Dale directly in 2004, Bud said. "He came out to the building once I was there and made an offer. Dale turned him down. All said something about Dale being unreasonable and Dale said something about the land not being for sale, and All left." He paused. "There was no agreement, verbal or otherwise. Dale was not a man who made agreements he didn't record, and he was not a man who would have made an unrecorded agreement with Warren All, whom he did not like or trust. Why didn't he like him?" Another pause. All had a habit of approaching people who owned land he wanted and constructing situations that put pressure on them. Boundary disputes, access complaints, water rights questions. Small things that cost money and attention to defend. Dale had watched him do it to two neighboring families before his own land came into All's sights. Bud's voice was level, factual. Dale recorded everything specifically because of All. He told me once that the best defense against a man like that was a paper trail so clean there was nothing to grab onto. I thought about my grandfather in Fenn's office, in the years after the machine started accumulating, making sure the documentation was right. Not because he was a suspicious or paranoid man but because he had watched how these things worked and he had prepared accordingly. He had been preparing for Warren All's successor for 20 years. "I'll call Fenn in the morning," Bud said. "He'll want a statement from me. I was there in 2004 when All made the offer and Dale refused it. I can say that clearly under oath if it comes to it." "I hope it doesn't come to that," I said. "It won't," Bud said, with the certainty of a man who has been around long enough to know the difference between a genuine threat and a pressure move. "They don't have anything. They're betting you don't know that." I thanked him and went in for my shift. The cardiovascular unit on a December night is a particular kind of busy, the kind that comes from the seasonal shift in cardiac events, the cold weather and the holiday stress and the way bodies that have been managing chronic conditions all year sometimes stop managing them in December. I worked 12 hours with the letter from Hargrove and Stills in the back of my mind, the way you carry something when you cannot act on it yet, present but contained, available when needed. At 3 in the morning, in the quiet between two patient checks, I stood at the window at the end of the corridor and looked out at the city and thought about Warren All's company sitting on adjacent land since 2019 and deciding in December of this year to send a letter. What had changed? What had made this the moment? The cider. The label with the address on it. The small batch operation that had not been there before. That signaled a living, active use of land that had appeared dormant. They had been watching the property and waiting for a sign that something was happening, and the first batch of cider had been that sign. A label with an address. A business where there had been none. A reason to apply pressure before the operation became established enough that Clara Marsh had too much invested to be pressured. They had moved too soon and with too little, which was what happened when you moved on assumption rather than information. My grandfather had known how All operated. He had documented accordingly. Fenn called me the following Monday. He had pulled the full title chain and found exactly what he expected to find, which was nothing. No recorded instrument of any kind suggesting a right of first refusal, a purchase option, an easement, or any other encumbrance on the eastern acreage. The title was clean back to the original family acquisition. He had also drafted a response letter to Hargrove and Stills that he described as firm, specific, and inviting them to produce any documentation supporting their client's claim, which he was confident they could not do. He had also spoken with Bud Harlan and taken a written statement. "They'll withdraw," Finn said. "Not immediately, because firms like that don't like to appear to fold quickly. But within 30 days. There's nothing there. And a competent attorney at Hargrove and Stills will tell their client that within a week of receiving our response." "And if they don't withdraw?" I said. "Then we file for a declaratory judgment establishing clear title. Bud's statement goes into evidence, and the court affirms what the recording already shows." He paused. "The development company doesn't want that outcome either. A public court record establishing that their claim was baseless is not useful to them when they try to move on the next property." He sent the response letter 3 days later. 22 days after that, Hargrove and Stills sent a one-paragraph letter withdrawing their inquiry and stating that their client had determined the matter did not warrant further action at this time. The phrase "at this time" was doing work in that sentence, the implication that the door was not fully closed, but Fenn said to disregard it, that it was standard language and that the practical reality was that they were done. I filed the withdrawal letter in the same folder as the deed and the appraisal and the representation letter and everything else that documented the Colton parcel, because that was the right place for it, with everything else that showed the ground was solid. I called Patrice that Sunday evening and told her about it. She listened without interrupting, which was her way, and when I finished she said, "He thought of that too, didn't he?" I said, "I think so." She said, "The documentation. That's why everything was recorded. Not just for the estate. For this. For someone doing exactly what All's company tried to do." I said, "I think that's right." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was a very patient man." He was, I said. They both were. I thought about Lottie in those years after Dale died, maintaining the machine log in her own hand, checking the building, keeping the relationship with Fenn and with Bud, doing all of it alone without announcing it to anyone. She had not only carried what he built, she had understood it well enough to maintain it, which required its own kind of knowledge, and she had done it for 11 years until the morning her crossword puzzle was not finished. Patient was not a strong enough word for what they had been. Patient implied waiting. What they had done was more active than that. They had worked, continuously and quietly, toward something they would not live to see completed, with no expectation of recognition from the people for whom they were working. That was a different order of thing. The second discovery happened in February. I was at the Colton building on a Saturday, helping Deanna move some of the processing equipment to a more efficient arrangement now that we understood the workflow better, when she found a door in the back wall that neither of us had noticed before. It was not hidden exactly. It was behind a tall shelving unit that had been in place since before I first came to the building, a heavy wooden shelf that held spare parts and equipment manuals from the machine storage era, and which neither of us had moved because it was against the wall and appeared to be simply furniture. When we shifted it to improve the flow of the workspace, the door appeared behind it. A standard interior door, wooden with a simple lever handle, the kind of door that does not announce itself. I stood and looked at it. Deanna said, "Well." I tried the lever. It opened easily, unlocked, into a small room that was not much larger than a generous closet, maybe 8 feet by 10, with the same timber framing as the main building and a single window on the exterior wall that had been blocked on the outside by the overgrowth along the building's rear foundation. The room smelled of the same dry wood as the rest of the building, undisturbed, sealed by the shelving unit and the blocked window into a stillness that was different from the stillness of the main space. On a low wooden table along the interior wall, there was a wooden box. Not the metal box I had found on the workbench the first day. A wooden box, unfinished, the same dovetail joint construction as the cedar box in my grandmother's bedroom, the same deliberate craftsmanship, clearly made by the same hands. It was latched, not locked. I opened it. Inside was a notebook thinner than the machine log with a plain brown cover and no label. And beneath the notebook, a large manila envelope sealed. Deanna said quietly that she was going to go check on the processing equipment, and she stepped back into the main building and pulled the door mostly closed behind her, which was the most tactful thing anyone had ever done for me. I carried the box to the table, sat down in the available chair, and opened the notebook. The first page was Dale's handwriting. But this was not the upright economical hand of the machine log. This was a looser hand, more personal, the handwriting of someone writing for themselves rather than for a record. The date on the first entry was June 2009, 3 years before Dale died. And it was written in a different season of his penmanship, the hand of a man who knew his time was shortening. He had written, "This is for Clara. Not a log. Just what I know." I sat with those 2 sentences for a moment. The notebook was 47 pages. Not a continuous narrative, entries of varying length spread across 2 years, from June 2009 to March 2011, which was roughly 16 months before his stroke. Some entries were short, a paragraph, a thought, a thing he had wanted to say. Some were longer, 2 or 3 pages, written in what appeared to be a single sitting with the pen pressure consistent throughout. The entries where he had sat down with something specific he needed to get down before it was lost. He wrote about the land. Not the legal dimensions or the appraised values, but the specific physical character of it. The way the eastern field drained in a wet spring and where the low spots were. The particular quality of the soil on the slope below the orchard that he said his mother had always called the sweet slope because of what it grew. The timber on the western edge in which trees were worth keeping and which had been volunteers that could be cleared without loss. He wrote about the machines, not as inventory but as stories, where each one had come from and what condition it had been in and the specific problem each restoration had presented and how it had been solved. He wrote about a trip he and Bud had taken to a sale in western Pennsylvania where they had driven through a snowstorm to bid on a piece and lost the bid to a buyer from Michigan, and about the drive back in the snow laughing about it, and about the piece they had found the following spring at a sale in Indiana that had been better than the Pennsylvania piece anyway. He wrote about Lottie. Not in the way you write about a person when you are trying to describe them to someone who does not know them, but in the way you write about someone you have lived alongside for 50 years and are trying to locate on a page before the opportunity is gone. He wrote about the way she kept things. About the garden and the shutters and the 3 aprons on the hook. He wrote that she was the more patient of the 2 of them, which surprised me because Dale had always seemed to me to be the patient one, but he said, "No, I am patient with machines. Lottie is patient with people and with time, which is harder because machines do not disappoint you and time is very long." He wrote about me. Not at length. 3 entries spread across the 2 years of the notebook. The first was from September 2009 and it said only, "Clara came for a weekend. She is doing well in the program. She has found something she is good at and she knows it. That is a gift some people never find." The second was from May 2010. He had been to Columbus for a medical appointment and had driven past my nursing school without stopping because he did not want to arrive unannounced. He had written, "I thought about going in but she is busy and building her life and I did not want to be the interruption. I will see her at Thanksgiving." That is enough. I had to stop reading for a moment after that one. The third was from January 2011. 7 months before his stroke. It was the longest of the 3 entries about me, and it was the entry where he explained in his own words what he had been thinking when he helped Lottie set up the Colton transfer. He wrote, "When I am gone, this land will either be an argument or an inheritance. I have thought about which one of them would handle it without letting it become an argument. Renee and Gordon both see land the way they see everything, as a problem to be solved quickly. Patrice would hold it carefully, but she doesn't have the particular kind of stubbornness that land requires. Clara does. She left and built something and she did it without asking for permission, and without waiting for anyone to tell her she was allowed to. That is the stubbornness. Not the loud kind. The kind that just keeps going." I asked Lottie what she thought and she said the same name without hesitating. That was enough for me. I set the notebook down on the table. Outside the small room, I could hear Deanna moving around in the main building. The quiet sounds of someone giving another person the time they need. The blocked window made the room dim despite the February afternoon outside, and the box sat on the table with the manila envelope still inside it, unopened. I sat with what I had just read for a long time. My grandfather had written my name in a notebook in a room behind a shelf in a building on 61 acres in Colton Township, and he had given his reasons plainly in the handwriting of a man who was running out of time and knew it. And the reasons were specific and considered and came from watching me for years from a distance that he had maintained not because he was indifferent but because he understood that the watching was the thing he could offer, and the recording was the way to make sure. The watching was not lost. He had known me without my knowing he was knowing me. I opened the manila envelope. Inside was a survey map, more detailed than the one I had, hand-annotated in Dale's handwriting. with notes about the soil quality in different sections, the drainage patterns, the timber species on the western edge with a rough count of board feet in the stands he thought were mature enough to harvest selectively. The sweet slope was marked with a small star and the words Lottie's word for it, the annotation so matter-of-fact that it took me a moment to understand what it meant, which was that he had been thinking about that slope while he was drawing the map and had written down what she called it because it was her name and it was the right name and he wanted it on the record. Behind the survey map was a single folded sheet of notepaper. Not the blue flower paper Lottie had used for her 4 lines. Plain white notepaper from a pad with a printed header for a hardware store in the county seat that had been closed for at least 15 years. Dale's handwriting. 3 lines. The orchard wants more trees on the south half of the sweet slope. The drainage is right and the aspect is right. Your grandmother knows the varieties. Ask her before she forgets and she will tell you which ones her mother planted and why. And then below that, a line that was not advice about trees. You came from something good, Clara. Don't let anyone tell you different. I held that piece of notepaper for a long time in the dim room behind the shelf that had hidden it from everyone, including me, for the 11 years since my grandmother had deeded the land to a granddaughter who did not know she owned it. I did not cry. I am not sure why. I had been close to it several times in the months since the apron pocket, at various moments where the accumulation of what they had done for me pressed against something I was not always prepared to absorb. But in the small dim room with the plain white notepaper in my hands, what I felt was not the precursor to tears but something further past that, something on the other side of grief, the place where you have absorbed the loss completely enough that what remains is not the weight of it but the warmth. He had known what he was building, and he had known who it was for, and he had been right about her, and she had been right about him, and all of it was still here, the land and the orchard and the sweet slope and the building that now smelled of apple cider instead of dry metal, and the notebook in the box on the table with 47 pages of a man who had wanted to say certain things before the opportunity closed. I put the survey map and the notepaper back in the envelope and the notebook back in the wooden box and carried the box out into the main building where Deanna was checking the cider temperature with the focused attention of a person who has understood that she is giving someone else a few more minutes. She looked at the box and then at me. You okay? She said. Yes, I said. I need to plant more trees. She looked at me for a moment. On the sweet slope? I had not used that phrase yet. I had not described the slope to her by any name at all. She had been walking the property since March and had apparently found it herself, the particular quality of the south-facing section below the orchard where the drainage ran right and the light held longer in the afternoon. I looked at her. That's what I call it, she said. I know that's not its name, but that's what I call it. I did not say anything for a moment. That's its name, I said. In March, I drove to the Hester County Library in the county seat, and spent a Saturday morning in the local history room going through the agricultural records for Colton Township from the early part of the last century. I was looking for the Marsh family land history, the chain of ownership before Dale, back to his mother's family, who had been the original holders of what became the Colton parcel. The records went back far enough to be illuminating. Dale's mother had been born a Colton, which was why the township had that name in the first place, which was a thing I had not known, which meant the land itself carried the family name in its designation, a fact so embedded in the county geography that no one had thought to mention it to me as relevant. The Colton family had held that land since the 1870s, farming it and passing it generation to generation, and the parcel had been one of the original pieces of the family's agricultural operation at a time when the Coltons were among the larger landholders in the eastern part of the county. What remained by the time it passed to Dale's mother was the 61 acres and the memory of what the family had once held and slowly dispersed, and what she had done with it was hold it, the way people hold the last piece of something when everything else is gone, not because it is the most useful piece but because it is the last one. She had given it to Dale. Dale had given it to Lottie. Lottie had given it to me. For generations, the land passing from hand to hand along the line of people who understood what holding it meant. I sat in the library with the records around me and thought about the name on the township, and the name on the deed, and the name on the label on the first batch of cider that was sitting in my apartment in 4 bottles with the address but no name. I drove back to Colton Township that afternoon. I stood at the end of the gravel track and looked down it toward the building and the orchard and the sweet slope behind it, and I thought about what to call the thing we were building here, Deanna and I, with the recovered trees and the new plantings that would go into the sweet slope this spring and the processing equipment in the building that had once held 7 covered machines, and now held something that would run every autumn as long as the trees ran. The label needed a name. The land had always had a name. In April, the new trees went in on the sweet slope. Deanna had done the research on varieties, consulting an extension agent from Ohio State who specialized in heritage cider apples and who had identified 3 varieties that matched the soil profile and the drainage and the aspect of that particular section of ground. We planted 18 trees in 2 rows, young whips that would not produce for 3 years but which would be, when they produced, the specific varieties that belonged in that specific place. Deanna planted. I dug the holes, which was the harder physical work and which I had insisted on because I wanted my hands in that ground, in the sweet slope that Dale had marked with a star on a survey map, and that his grandmother had given a name and that 4 generations of one family had held through the years when everything else was being dispersed. We finished in the late afternoon and stood at the top of the slope and looked down the 2 rows of young trees, small and bare, each one staked against the April wind that came off Greer Ridge with enough force to move a new planting if it was not supported. Deanna said, 3 years. I said, 3 years. She said, worth it. I said, worth it. The label was printed in May. Cream paper, the same clean type, the address in small letters at the bottom. And at the top, in the same clean font, the name. Colton Orchard. Not a marketing decision. Not a brand. Just what the place had always been, the land and its name together. Finally on a label where anyone who held the bottle could read it, which was the most public and the most matter-of-fact way I could think of to say what the land was and where it came from and whose it had been. Deanna held the first printed label and looked at it for a moment. Good name, she said. It was always the name, I said. I sent a bottle to Philip Garrett in Virginia with a note that said the cider was from the orchard on the property where the threshing machine had been stored, and that if he ever came to Ohio he was welcome to see what the land had become. He wrote back a week later a short note, the kind of note a careful man writes when he wants to say something without overstating it, and he said that it was good to know the land was in use, and that Dale Marsh's work on the threshing machine had impressed his staff and that the machine was running beautifully and that he thought of it as one of the best acquisitions the museum had made. He said the work was clearly done by someone who understood what they were working on. I wrote back and said that was exactly right, and that the person who had done it had understood most things that mattered very well indeed. I keep the notebook in the wooden box on the shelf in my bedroom, next to Lottie's aprons on the hook. I have read it several times now, not all at once, 1 or 2 entries at a time, the way you go back to a conversation you want to make last. Some of the entries I return to more than others. The one about the Pennsylvania auction and the drive home in the snow. The one where he described Lottie's patience with time as harder than patience with machines. The 3 entries with my name in them. The last entry in the notebook is from March 2011. The final one before the stroke took most of what he had left. It is short, 4 sentences, written in the looser hand that the later entries all had. The hand of a man whose body was beginning to cost him things. He wrote, the building is dry. The machines are in good order. The land is recorded. The rest is Clara's to figure out. The rest is Clara's to figure out. He had written that in 2011 and I had found it in February of the year the first cider batch was ready, and the rest had taken everything in between to figure out, the apron pocket and the county recorder and the gravel track and the appraiser's report and the family meeting and the pressure letter from a Columbus law firm and the small room behind the shelf and the survey map with the star on the sweet slope. I was still figuring it out. The spring planting was done and the 18 trees were in the ground and the 3rd year of the cider operation was coming and the label was printed and the name was on it and I was still a nurse in Cincinnati working nights and covering shifts and doing the work I was good at. And I was also on Saturday mornings driving southeast toward Greer Ridge with coffee in a thermos and the brass key on my ring. The key that opened the door that was behind the shelf. The key that opened the building. The key that Lottie had carried in her pocket for 11 years, and pressed into the hand of the person she had decided to trust. I carry it still. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying. But it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours, and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.